Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar on delivering high-quality customer-focused outcomes. This is a webinar that's been hosted by DTP jointly with our colleagues at Capsticks, and we're delighted that everyone can join us. Just by way of introductions, I will say that the webinar is being recorded and will appear on the DTP YouTube channel later on for those that might want to watch it again. Just to introduce our lovely panel today, we're really delighted to be joined by Karen Doran, who is Director of Regulatory Engagement at the Regulator of Social Housing, by Hannah Pryce, who is the Company Secretary at Bournville Village Trust, and Mark Jones, who is an Executive Director at ACIS Group, and by our co-host Darren Hooker, who is a partner at Capsticks. What we want to do today is talk a little bit about how review of services, using information in relation to your performance, and in particularly the customer voice, can result in really effective prioritisation of service, and also about really good service outcomes. And I think really important that this is, I suppose, we're not specifically talking about inspection here. We're very much talking about what is important to customers, to residents, and also about how to achieve that real improvement in performance. So each of our speakers have got some really good insights into this from very different perspectives. So without much ado, I'm going to continue. What I would say is, for everybody who's attending, if you have any particular questions, please do raise those in the chat. And at the end, we'll be able to pick out, probably not all of them, but 2 or 3 of them, and pick those up at the end. So I'm going to turn first to Karen from the regulator. Karen, clearly you have a very key role in relation to regulating a lot of the providers who have joined us today. But I just wondered, from the work that you've been seeing, particularly, I suppose, since the introduction of the consumer standards, what are the sorts of things that you're seeing that makes a real difference in terms of that service delivery, and any themes you're seeing about good core service provision?
Hi, and hi everybody, good afternoon. Thanks, Angela. Yeah, there are definitely themes. So obviously we've been doing our regulatory activities that have included the consumer regulation since April 2024. I think for me, sort of 4 things come out. So definitely risk and management of risk, reporting, data, and then I suppose the thing that ties all of that together is culture. Which definitely, we don't go in regulating culture, but you certainly come out of an organisation understanding a bit more about it. Shall I pick up a few of those
Yes,
themes and just go through?
Yeah.
I mean, hopefully these themes, the other sessions today, so Hannah, Mark and Darren will pick up on those and sort of illustrate them in practice, which I think is going to be really useful. And there's nothing particularly new in those themes. To be honest, you could relate them to any sector and market, and they're reflected in sort of regulatory and governance codes of any kind. Particularly that sort of transparency on the effectiveness of controls against your risks, that sort of emphasis on openness, being really honest, having those honest conversations and being transparent with your stakeholders, as well as being accountable for using resources wisely. So value for money, I think, sort of comes through all of this as well. And often it really is about going back to the basics of a well-run organisation, rather than sort of tinkering around the edges in some of the areas. I think risk tends to be central to all we see. So more specifically, risk, internal controls, assurance on those. And what we're seeing specifically is that managing risk fundamental to the way in which you work is a characteristic of those landlords where we've more easily seen evidence of good quality outcomes being delivered. And a kind of proactive approach to that other side of performance and delivery, which is if you minimise the risk of failure in service delivery and in safety and quality of tenants' homes, and that's where you get the consistent good outcomes. In terms of what that sort of looks like in practice in an organisation, so what we pick up from the documents we look at and the conversations we have, we see a frequent focus on controls. We see a real challenge on whether the organisation's actually getting assurance as opposed to reassurance. Some board reports tell a really lovely story and a good narrative, but very light on sort of data and sources of evidence and assurance. There's also, you know, in some organisations, they do have a mindset of, you know, could that happen here? So there's, you know, we publish regulatory judgments, there's plenty out there in the sector of when things go wrong. And actually just that mindset of, you know, where do we stand in that particular area and what might we need to do to strengthen and mitigate risk. I think one thing that we see in housing associations, but you know, you can have equivalent in local authorities, is a really active, well supported and challenging audit and risk function. Really flexing its role, not shying away from asking for specific assurance and saying, look, this is not giving us what we need on this risk. We're getting increasingly worried. We need something different here. I think on reporting, it is a challenge to get the balance right between what you report as officers to committees, to board, cabinet, and something that the teams do and have talked to me about is scenarios where they look at an organisation that has taken almost all of its sort of tenant services, consumer areas, the kind of being a landlord stuff, and put it in a particular committee. And that kind of makes sense. You know, you're giving a bit more time to it, more focus. Often residents are more clearly linked into that committee. But then on the other side, what they also see is an organisation that has said, customer services are absolute priority. Safety is a real focus for us. We have a huge grip on all of those areas. We really want to improve repairs, whatever it is. We have that stated when we look in board papers, in the discussion at board, even at the discussion in exec, and in our meetings with individual board committee members and officers. We're left thinking, it's all sitting in the committee, but you don't have, that hasn't made you more effective. You don't have, you're actually less connected into those big areas. So how do you know that actually risks are being managed, that you've got the right level of assurance, that there's a likelihood of delivery of services, of improvement? How would you know that you needed to intervene as a board? So whilst you can kind of get more focus and kind of delegate some things, you've got to hold that grip and that sort of enough information to make you more effective as a board and exec and officers as well. I think we also see kind of, is the reporting complete enough, whether it's at committee and board officer level, to really give you the knowledge you need to manage risks. And a fairly basic example, not so prevalent now, is around the reporting on whether the risk around homes being safe for tenants to live in. So, you know, previously we would have seen just gas safety checks being reported on. We then moved over time to compliance on all of the big areas of health and safety. But still we were seeing too infrequently a lack of information on whether the remedial actions were being done. Actually, what was the severity of remedial actions across other areas of health and safety? What was the timeliness, the volume? Was there a backlog? Was there particular themes? Because clearly just knowing that you're doing the checks isn't enough to give you assurance on that risk. And that was just a sort of clear example of where the reporting didn't and the data didn't match the risk. And I think just on data, you know, we see some landlords demonstrate real curiosity about what their data is telling them and acting on it. And we can see that they've kind of understood that and acted, triangulating different sources of data to get a better understanding of what the outcomes really are like. Because you can take a few metrics in a service and think it's all is well, but actually you've got other data that would contradict that. You know, whether that's outcomes in safety and quality, or whether it's about tone of communication. You know, you have a range of information that can tell you about that, or the professionalism of those carrying out the services. All of that adds into the quality. I think for some landlords it's more fundamental in that the data itself is just poor quality, never mind what you do with it. And we see again that that might have come up in internal audits or external reviews, but no one's escalated it as a recurring theme. And so you know, or it might be that basic kind of data quality controls aren't in place or they're not operating, and maybe focusing and fixing those things has been sidelined by the promise of a new IT system. And it's just probably an area where if you're in that position, you just can't tinker with it. It needs a whole organisation data governance approach as well. And we've seen some landlords do that really well. I was just going to finish off then my little bit just on sort of bringing round to an area that Hannah and Mark certainly will talk about, which is the repair service. And I think this comes up time and time again. It's been a key driver of some of our C2 and 3 judgments. I think this webinar is really timely in terms of it's an area where I have thought for a wee while that the sector could do more collaborative work to understand different models, what has the greatest impact, you know, because it does range from culture, from communication to geography, procurement, contract management. There's such a lot in that service, and it's, you know, it's a huge number in the plan, isn't it, in terms of cost, and has been hugely increasing. So I think where we see our inspections where that's really an organisation's tried to get to the root of the issues there, has really yielded the better kind of more consistent improvement. And then just to round it off with culture, you know, that culture of really valuing insight to sort of shape and deliver services, sort of, you know, effective use not just of data about homes, but on diverse needs, vulnerability, and, you know, being able to evidence how your decision making and how the approach that you take to good service delivery does take into account what's coming out of engagement and scrutiny and all of the other insight you have. So I'm just going to leave it there if that's okay.
It absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Karen. It's such a great introduction because it does, I think, really provide that overarching framework of key issues. They are all clearly interlinked. You know, I can't think of an I suppose if you take repairs and maintenance, you know, one of the key things is if you have an issue with it, then there is that massive thing about how you are communicating with your tenants and residents. Who are you communicating with? How are you communicating with them at a very baseline before you even start doing all the changes that you need to do? So I think that linkage between risk, culture, use of resources is absolutely, you know, so strong. And I suppose I would say that is where there is that very clear link between the G rating and the C rating, where that applies to the provider. It does bring us very neatly to Hannah and to Mark. And Hannah, I know that you have at Bournville undertaken a sort of series of quite fundamental service reviews in order to get at the, you know, to rebuild really in relation to some of those services. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about what you've done, but in particularly, you know, what's been for you sort of the key things that you've taken from that in terms of improving on those service outcomes?
Well, thanks, Angela, and good afternoon, everybody. So I think it would be helpful to go back to about 2023 for us. So our overall customer satisfaction and satisfaction with a number of areas was well below where we wanted it to be. Customers were frequently telling us either through satisfaction surveys, complaints, social media, and just through our everyday conversations that we weren't getting back to them consistently. They were having to call us to chase a response. We weren't consistently identifying and making reasonable adjustments for customers or household members with additional needs. Customers were frustrated at the length of time it was taking to get the repairs done. We weren't always sending the right operatives to complete a repair, or we didn't have the right parts for the job, which just wasted tenants' time. Jobs were being cancelled or arranged at short notice, which was really frustrating customers. Customers weren't happy about how their blocks and green spaces were being managed, and our communication through the customer journey across a number of service areas, particularly repairs, just wasn't good enough. So in response to this, the board approved 3 comprehensive service reviews to take place in 2024 as part of our annual plan projects. As it was clear, the general service improvement projects we were doing weren't making the impact needed. So like Karen said, we had to go back to basics and stop tinkering around the edges. So these were really comprehensive service reviews. So the 3 reviews were around our repairs, and that included a full review of our in-house responsive repairs delivery, customer offer, and that included a full review of the customer data we collect, our approach to identifying and making positive adjustments for customers with additional needs, how customers access our customer services team and the wider teams, and agreeing really clear service standards for responding to customers, including internal customers as well, because that was an area we discovered was getting in the way. We also did a review on our block services and grounds maintenance, and that included a full review of how our blocks and communal areas are managed to keep them safe and clean, and our delivery of the grounds maintenance, which we also deliver in-house through our grounds maintenance teams. So the reviews themselves followed a project management approach. They were informed by a range of customer data and insight, including things like tenant satisfaction measures, transactional satisfaction surveys, complaints, compliments, feedback from social media. And we also analysed a lot of data, so core data as well, which I think Mark will probably talk about in a bit more detail, such as the volumes and natures of customer contacts, repair types, frequency and repeat call-outs, for example. So in terms of customer engagement through these reviews, we knew that that was critical. So we engaged in different ways. So for the repairs review, we held drop-in sessions for tenants in venues across our neighbourhoods, and we established a maintenance advisory panel of tenants who worked with us throughout the review. For the customer offer review, we targeted our engagement with customers who told us there were additional needs within their household. And for the block services review, we dropped postcards with QR codes through tenants' doors and held pop-up sessions across our neighbourhoods to engage with a range of people. We also established a continuous improvement group, which was chaired by the chief exec and consists of exec team members, heads of service and other officers. The group meets monthly to ensure that we've got a really joined up approach and oversight of all of those projects together, because there were definitely some areas that overlapped. And that's all part of our great BVT services strategy, which is really about having really strong foundations for all of our service areas. And again, as Karen said, going back to basics. So that group also looks over things such as policy and process development as well, and making sure that we really do really good quality impact assessments and customer insight assessments as well. So that really helped make sure the projects didn't drift and momentum was maintained throughout the reviews, because these were big reviews and there was a real risk that they could have drifted or become delayed because there was a lot of work involved. The board also monitored high-level progress as part of our quarterly annual plan reporting, and then further detail was reported at our Customer and Neighbourhoods Committee as well. So I mentioned earlier that we established a maintenance advisory panel of tenants to help inform our repairs comprehensive service review alongside the wider customer insight data, and they provided really good challenge throughout the review. So we identified tenants to take part in that panel through our BVT Voices resident involvement database, and also tenants who'd previously raised complaints about the repairs service were invited to take part. So the panel met throughout the review to check and challenge, which they did really well, the team's findings and recommendations for improvements. So as a result of the panel's involvement, we co-created the new repairs policy and the service statement, which is published for all tenants. We clarified emergency repair times. For example, we always had a standard 24-hour response time for emergency repairs in our policy, but we always aimed to respond to some emergencies sooner, especially if there was an immediate health and safety risk. So the panel challenged us and agreed that, yes, we should be responding within 4 hours in these cases. So why wasn't it set out in the policy so customers knew what they could expect and be able to hold us to account for meeting that commitment? So that was built into the new policy. We added 24-hour response time for external door repairs where a block isn't secure, because that was a priority of customers that was coming through some of the consultation and the engagement. And we added clear repair categories for things that were unclear, such as showers and glazing. And we removed a lot of jargon, such as condensed pipes and things for boilers that people are like, just tell us what it really is, and then we can hold you to account for it and know where we stand. So we also improved how tenants can request improvement works to their homes, because it previously got stuck between a couple of departments and it was getting really sticky and customers were left without clear answers at the end of it. So there was a lot of work that they supported for us to kind of bottom out those grey areas to make sure we had a clear approach. The wider customer insight also resulted in key changes to a number of areas, which were supported by the maintenance advisory panel. So overhauling the way the customer service advisors diagnose repairs and making sure the right questions are asked when customers contact us to understand any additional needs within the household, which also linked to our customer offer comprehensive service review. Created a clear workflow and communication points throughout the life of the repair to keep customers updated, which was a really key frustration for customers from that. When they've reported the repair, they wanted clear updates throughout the life until that repair was completed. And there were a lot of other improvements that we made, including changes to structures and systems, but I'll only focus on the ones directly linked to customer insight and engagement today. So maintenance advisory panel members then formed the foundation of our new Your Home scrutiny group with other tenants, and they monitor the implementation of the improvements, and then now they've continued to scrutinise and challenge the repairs and maintenance services. Now most of those improvement activities have been implemented. For the customer offer review, we use customer insight and feedback through engagement to develop really customer focused, flexible and inclusive policies. So we'd fallen into a habit in some areas of trying to dust policies off and get them reviewed to make sure we've met the deadlines. We really did take that step back to go back to basics, to really look at customer insight. What's the customer experience with these policies? So we did that for all of our customer focused policies. We created clear and consistent customer service offer, including service standards and response times, which are now actively monitored and reported on by team level at exec to make sure that we're ensuring accountability, especially while that's becoming embedded. We created guidance notes and held workshops with colleagues to help adapt their communication style with customers, looking at emails that have been sent and letters, and can we make them more customer friendly and more reflective of our values and our style. And we agreed an approach to collecting customer data and information about additional needs in ways which work for our customers. For the block services and grounds maintenance review, customer insight and feedback has resulted in a complete structural change to the way blocks are managed, and that includes investment to create a brand new estate caretaking team. Structural changes and further investments into our grounds maintenance services have happened as a result. And a new Your Neighbourhood scrutiny group of tenants and residents has been established to oversee those services as well. So as you can see, it's been a busy few years, and we know there's still work to do to further embed the improvements from the 3 comprehensive service reviews, and we'll definitely continue to monitor their impact. And through our Great BVT services strategy, we've adopted a continuous improvement approach. So that'll be really key to making sure that we continually adapt and improve services to meet changing needs. We've got 3 comprehensive service reviews planned for 26 around the allocation of our homes, how we best provide services and support for tenants with complex or additional needs, and also our approach to procurement. So we'll continue with a similar approach using data, customer insight and further customer engagement for these reviews as well. We're also planning to engage with customers as part of our strategic review this year that will help inform our new corporate plan. So although this webinar isn't focused on inspection preparation, the positive work that we've been doing, especially over the last 3 years, really helped when we were asked to provide evidence as part of our inspection. And we were really proud to receive a C1 grade as part of our regulatory judgment published in September last year. So hopefully that gives you a really broad overview of how we approached our core service reviews, which a few minutes doesn't do justice to the amount of work that was involved in those. But hopefully that helped, and I'll hand back to you now, Angela.
Thanks, Hannah. I mean, there's a huge amount in there, just a huge amount. And I know, I mean, brilliant for you to fit it into sort of less than 15 minutes. I think the thing that I really take heart from in what you've just described is how those customers that were perhaps dissatisfied or, you know, felt that they hadn't received the service that they wished to receive are the ones that you've had involved from the start, but now they are continuing, you know, to support and scrutinise the delivery of the change service. And I think that's what everybody would want to see, isn't it? You know, that you can bring people along and they still feel that they have something that they can offer and which is adding value to the service going forward. So it's great to hear. So Repairs and maintenance, clearly, we all know, you know, it's just such a really strong, I mean, it is the core part, isn't it, of a landlord's service. And Mark, I know at ACES you have made some radical changes in quite a different way, I think, to what BVT have done. And I wondered if you could just give us the heads up on what you've done, but in particular, I'm really interested if, and this may be a really unfair question, Mark, so feel free to be grumpy with me, about whether there are sort of two key learnings from the whole process that you'd undertaken that you'd like to convey to everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Angela, and good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I'll talk a bit more about repairs and maintenance in action, I suppose I'd call it. At ACES, historically, sort of going back, I think the reactive repair service had there's very much been the poor relation, and it had struggled really to deliver over quite a long period of time. We have an in-house team, we have a DLO. Back in 2021, looking at the service there, it was very traditional. So the classic repair priority times, emergency urgent routine. Average time to complete a job was 24 days. Had a backlog of around a couple of thousand out of time repairs, and had tried a number of times to reduce those down, but hadn't really got on top of it. And similar to Hannah, sort of high levels of dissatisfaction, communication was an issue, and residents, I suppose, just high levels of complaints about the repairs process service itself. So not a good picture. We wanted to take a real kind of root and branch approach to repairs and maintenance. I suppose it's like recognising that it's probably the most important service to residents. It's the one that they will judge the rest of the association by. So if you get repairs and maintenance wrong, actually, you know, you're in a hiding to nothing from the absolute start. So step one was to remove all of the out-of-time jobs, and by February, by rediverting resources, those had all gone, and we were ready then to put a new system in place. We piloted a new approach using lean management techniques and an operational excellence model. And what I mean by that is by focusing on minimising the amount of time from when a resident contacted us, predominantly by phone, to an operative turning up and completing the job, and anything else in between that we viewed as waste. It wasn't adding customer value. So this was at a time when we were using scheduler rates, using diagnostic software, you know, the classic things that are in a traditional repair service. All of that went. We piloted an approach whereby when the resident rang in, they were put through to the operative immediately. The operative then diagnosed the repair. The operative made an appointment directly with the resident and then completed the repair. Over a period of 6 months, we then expanded that across the whole of our stock. And to give you an idea of our geography, because Karen mentioned it, and it is important, we've got about 3,000 properties in around the Gainsborough, West Lindsey area, 1,000 in Sheffield, and the remainder are geographically dispersed around South Yorkshire and the East Midlands and Lincolnshire, so quite a wide area. Prior to actually implementing the pilot, we carried out quite a detailed analysis of repairs data over the previous 2 years so that we could define the repairs demand, reactive repairs demand per postcode, right down to the trade, to by the hour. So give us a real diagnostic picture of where our demand is. And too many times have I heard that reactive repairs, you can't predict it. Well, I'm sorry, I don't agree. You know, it gets cold in winter and it rains. You know, we know this. So actually you can have peaks of demand. You will have peaks of demand in winter, peaks of demand on Monday after a bank holiday, etc. So what we wanted to do was reallocate our resource to our highest areas of demand, and recognising that we want operate over a wide geographical area, subcontract that work on the edges where potentially it's not effective really for us to send an operative 2 or 3 hours out, and that high amount of non-productive time, and to zone operatives into specific areas to minimise the time from them leaving home to completing the job. So over a period of about 6 months, we rolled this out, put in new IT to automate our processes. And received some pretty stark results. So going from having at the start of the pilot, so in December 2021, we had 1,200 out of time repairs, and we have currently got 4. In our TSM response for last year, we completed 99.9% of non-emergency repairs in time, and 99.9% of emergencies in time. There are only 6 emergencies that weren't complete in time, and 11 non-emergency repairs. Perception, satisfaction, prior to the new system putting in place was around 75% satisfied with repairs. It was 86% at the start of this financial year. To the end of December, it's 93%. Transactional satisfaction has been fairly consistent, and it's been running mid-90s. So in December, it's 97%. So just to explain a bit more, just a little bit about the process. So residents will contact us, and if they contact us before 3 o'clock, they get a call back from the operative that day, who make the diagnostic and then arrange an appointment directly to complete the repairs. If residents ring after 3, they get a call back the following day from the operative to complete the repair. We've seen operatives. You mentioned sort of culture. That is a really important point, because at the start of the project, there was a bit of a reluctance to speak to customers directly, saying, well, I don't think that's our job, that's a planner's job. And I said, well, actually, no, you're an employee, you're representing ASIS. And once we got through that with them, actually, the residents really valued speaking to that operative up front, as opposed to speaking to a customer service assistant, then a planner, then another operative, and it might be going to the wrong trade, and then an operative, and then the circle continues and continues. And the feedback that we receive is interesting, because we send a text out for every single repair, and we get about a 20% response rate for that. And so the focus for us is very much on not necessarily what's gone right, but it's what's gone wrong. So the team, the planners and the supervisors go through every repair where we get negative comments from residents, and then we'll go through that, lessons learned, what can we do, what can we change, because our model is very much of building the infrastructure around the operative and trying to remove any blockages that is preventing them from doing that job right first time. So it's a different mindset. Interestingly, another change that we put in place was a set of shift working for operatives. So we've got 10 core trades working a 4-on, 4-off shift, so they work a 12-hour day. So we're able to offer a repair service from 8 in the morning till 8 at night, 7 days a week. So sort of recognising that residents' time is important, and we want to maximise our efficiency and capacity in-house. Costs, I'll just mention costs. So prior to the pilot going live 2021, in terms of the global accounts, our costs were £937 per unit, reactive repairs, voids and cyclical. That's against a sector average of around £1,100. In 2024, this sector average had gone up to about £1,600. So recognising that costs have increased across in the sector. And our cost was £1,200. But where we sit in terms of the group of RPs within the overall 200 that submitted their accounts, we were the 57th cheapest in 2021. We're now the 37th cheapest in 2024. So it has worked for us in terms of those quality outcomes, satisfaction increases, but also in terms of reduction of cost. I'll stop there. And you asked me a couple of questions, Angela. It was about 2 key learnings. Only 2. Yeah, I mean, I think one is about providing a modern service and being demand-led and not being capacity-led. So redesign your service in order to your customers' demand. That's going to be crucially important, and shape it accordingly. The other one, I think, is really about being a bit bold. This is my 40th year in social housing, and when I started, I can remember that same priority repair system, urgent, emergency, routine. Well, that's 40 years ago. When you went into a shop or when you purchased something, when you went to a restaurant, the service that you had 40 years ago is very different from the service that we receive now. Why should our residents be any different?
Yeah.
So I do think there's something there about challenging the norms, and actually challenging some of our commonly held, conventions about the way that we deliver a service. And I do think housing is conservative with a small c, and that we should modernise, and we should really sort of approach this as if we're receiving the service ourselves.
Thanks, Mark. And you did sort of anticipate one of the questions I was going to ask you, because I think the way in which you've changed the service is really dependent upon those front-facing operatives. Forgive me if I've got this wrong, but sort of changing their approach to their role and to how that is delivered to the customer. So I was really interested when you said about that whole cultural piece, the values, the service standards, and how they are. I don't think that's any different, actually. In some respects, they've always been the people who've been going into people's homes on behalf of the landlord, but getting that change is something that I think is a real achievement. So,
Thank you. Yeah. No, I mean, it was crucially important, and I think too often operatives will say, "Well, we're not listened to. We raise issues, and they're not resolved." So a key part of rolling out the pilot for us was that we met, and I met with the operatives every single day and went through each one of their issues until they were resolved. And so these were like the pearls, really, and being able to identify if a material supplier isn't performing or performing to the right level, if the van stock's not right. If the vehicle needs to be repaired, well, actually, can you get the repairer coming out to the operative himself? You need to sort of stand in the operative shoes and remove those barriers. And once they actively see some of those issues being resolved, they get more buy-in to the organisation.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. So we've heard two really sort of, detailed fundamental service changes. Darren, I know from your perspective, you've been probably involved a bit more like me in terms of evaluating how well some of those changes are working. And I know you've been involved in some particularly sort of large scale change programs. So I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on the sort of support you've provided and the things that you're seeing working or not.
Yeah, absolutely happy to do that. Thanks very much, Angela. And afternoon, everyone. So just to quickly reintroduce myself, I'm a partner at Capsticks Solicitors, and I head up the governance and regulatory work that we do with our RP clients. So I advise on compliance with the regulatory standards and the inspection process. And I just want to spend a bit of time talking about some of the work that we Capsticks have been doing in relation to helping RPs in this subject that we're talking about here. Hannah and Mark have obviously spoken about some of the practical implementation. I want to talk a bit more about the kind of broader governance structural angle. And specifically, I want to spend a bit of time talking about London Borough of Newham, which the audience may be aware, should be aware, was the first RP to receive a C4 regulatory grading back in October 24. And you may have seen in Inside Housing, etc., that Capsticks carried out a lessons learned investigation into the housing function there at Newham, particularly looking at the delivery of housing services and the corporate reporting around those services, with a view to making recommendations for improvement and ultimately getting away from that C4. I was actually with the Mayor and their Scrutiny Commission last night talking through some of that. And in order to be transparent with the regulator, with its residents, with the wider public, and effectively to hold itself accountable, Newham has actually published in full our report. So you can read that if you're interested. So as we know, a C4 grading obviously means there are very serious failings in the delivery of the outcomes required, which require fundamental change. And no doubt you've seen the type of issues that the regulatory judgment identified. I won't repeat them in full, but they're the types of themes that we've commonly seen in the C3 and C4 gradings. We've touched on them already: stock condition, health and safety, repairs, decent home standard, and so on. Now, as a result of their regulatory judgment and as a result of the work that's come out of it, including, as I say, Capsticks' own investigation, Newham now has a very clear picture on where its housing services are and where improvements need to be made. It is, though, unfortunate for Newham and unfortunate for its residents that it is, of course, coming after the inspection process and didn't happen beforehand. So The first really obvious lesson here is to be proactive in reviewing housing services and outcomes and resident focus and everything else. We shouldn't be waiting for an inspection to do so, and you shouldn't be effectively trying to cram before an exam in order to try and get a C1, C2. I would also say that getting a C1 shouldn't be the aim. The aim should be to have at all times effective housing delivery, which is providing safe and suitable quality accommodation for residents. A C1 is then just simply confirmation of that fact rather than being an end of itself. And that's why this session is focused on the improvement and the delivery of services rather than being an inspection preparation session. And in a similar vein, an effective service review shouldn't focus too much on the outcome. One of the interesting things with Newham was that actually at the same time it was getting its C4, it was also publishing TSM scores that gave it the highest satisfaction score of any local authority in London. So an interesting juxtaposition there with what the customer voice was potentially telling them. And this, I think, highlights that there is a risk of just looking at outcomes or just looking at the output data, certainly if that is not being triangulated with other data sources. Now, we don't necessarily, therefore, want to be too outcome focused. We want to focus on the underlying fundamentals, the governance, the data, the reporting, the themes we've already spoken about. Karen and Hannah both mentioned it earlier. We need to go back to basics, because ultimately, if those foundations are not strong, an RP is never going to be able to build an effective housing service on top of those foundations. Now, Newham as a local authority doesn't receive a G grade for governance, but over the last year or so, we've seen other housing associations receive a C3 grade and then also receive a G3 grade. So Notting Hill Genesis and Hanover, North London Muslim Housing Association, they all had issues in relation to safety and quality of their homes, which were a direct result of governance issues as well, and specifically failures in relation to their risk and control framework. So the lesson there is clear: poor governance begets poor consumer outcomes. And again, to reiterate the point, if you're building on the foundation of poor governance, you will, in the fullness of time, also end up with poor consumer outcomes as well. So again, reiterate what Karen and Hannah have already said, go back to basics. And this is really what our work with Newham highlighted. There were, as I've already mentioned, a wide range of issues: stock condition, decent homes, health and safety, repairs. And our report into the investigation was around 100 pages long, looking at a range of factors across the breadth of the organisation. But actually, so much of the report at its core was quite simple. So much of what we said came back to data, and Karen's already spoken about this, but data is absolutely core to effective service delivery. Again, you cannot make good decisions if you do not have a full understanding of the current position. And as I say, this is something we saw time again in Newham, and people that we'd speak to through the process, and people I was even speaking to last night, would ask me questions like, why didn't so-and-so tell me about this? Why did they lie to me? And the answer is simply they didn't know, and they couldn't know because there wasn't accurate, up-to-date, complete data in place. Poor data is a governance issue that then feeds into an operational issue. But interestingly, to pick up another theme we've been speaking about today, it can also become a cultural issue because it feeds potentially into feelings of mistrust, of people feeling that others are obscuring information, that they're deceiving them. And ultimately, this can lead to a real breakdown within an organization of relationships, the relationship between operational staff and management, or between management and the board, can really be undermined by poor data. So I don't think it's possible to overemphasize or overstate the importance of data. And when we're meaning data, we of course mean facts and figures about the service, but we also mean resident voice, which is what we've been speaking about today. What they're telling you about their own experiences, about the services they're receiving. That's a really important data point, as Hannah talked about earlier. Any review of your services must include a review of your data and your systems. And if we're talking about prioritization of resources, then ensuring effective data systems should be at the very top of your list. And what we see in our clients is those that spend the time investing into their data systems has a really positive knock-on effect. It improves the culture, it improves the governance and insurance framework. Ultimately, it improves resident outcomes. So you can really effectively interrogate your data now, and that will mean you take really meaningful steps in improving the outcomes for your residents. Of course, then what you do with the data is of fundamental importance as well. It's not enough to just collect it. And again, this is basic stuff. It shouldn't be surprising to you. But this is, again, something that Newham struggled with. And fundamentally, an organisation needs to understand the role that everybody within it plays in ensuring its effective running. The question that you should be asking is, what resources and information do we need to provide each person or each group within our structure in order to effectively support them in delivering their role? And what we saw in Newham, what we sometimes see in other organisations as well, is a complex governance structure and potential confusion around how it should actually operate in practice. And the interesting thing here is that good intentions can sometimes lead to bad outcomes. So, for example, identifying an issue as being important and needing a strong response, often leading then to setting up a specific group to deal with that. And that may be a noble aim and a perfectly fine thing to do if you have one particular issue. But as more and more issues arise, you start creating an unnecessarily complex structure with add-ons of committees and overlapping responsibilities, confusion around where reporting should go and where decisions should be taken. So an effective review should, in my view, take a step back, effectively start with a blank sheet of paper, design what you think an effective governance structure should look like from the ground up, rather than just continually adding to what you already have and ending up with this kind of washing line of groups and committees. So the decision around structure is really important, but so then too is the decision on how and what to report within that structure. We hear from our clients that sometimes their boards are struggling to stay strategic under the deluge of information that they're being provided with and which they're expected to seek assurance on. So they need to review what information is being circulated within their organisation. What information are they providing to boards? Does that information effectively support delivery of their role? And as has already been spoken about, there is a balance here between providing enough relevant information and not inundating them with information that actually hinders their ability to provide strategic oversight. So going back to Newham, we saw examples of reports that were hundreds of pages long with a lot of narrative detail, and Karen's already touched on a similar point here. The reports told a nice story, but question, did that effectively support performance of people in their roles? Or did that very detailed narrative actually dilute the really important facts and figures, the customer voice that needed to be heard? I'll leave you to make up your own opinion on that. So I've spoken about data collection and the reporting that goes into decision making. I just want to finish by talking very briefly about the decision making itself and what follows then after that. So obviously, once a decision's been made, it needs to actually be actioned in order to deliver the outcome required. And what our review of Newham revealed was instances where decisions were made, but then seemingly just slipped off of the agenda of future meetings and were not therefore followed up on and not therefore actioned appropriately. Again, you may think this is very basic stuff, but it is absolutely critical that the governance processes around decision making are properly recording the decisions taken and are making sure that they are indeed then prioritised and followed up on. I won't dwell on this point, and it should go without saying that if this doesn't happen, then the decision may as well not have been taken to begin with, and your residents are then not going to feel that they are being listened to, that their concerns are being treated sufficiently seriously. So nothing I've spoken about now has been revolutionary. It shouldn't really come as a surprise to you. But what I wanted to really do was highlight the need for organisations to step back from the operational outcomes, review the effectiveness of the structure that they are operating in as well. And to my mind, that's going to have the biggest impact in terms of improving outcomes in consumer services, which is what this session is all about and why we're all ultimately here. Again, to reiterate the point I made earlier, if you are building on the foundation of shaky ground, on the foundation of poor governance, poor data, poor reporting, then you're always going to have difficulties in delivering positive outcomes further down the line. If you invest into the fundamentals, then you're going to reap the benefits of that many times over a period of many years to come. Ultimately, that's going to have the biggest positive benefit in terms of improving customer outcomes and really embedding the tenant voice within your structure. So that's all I wanted to cover, Angela. Thank you.
Thank you, Darren. And I think that rounds back really well to Karen's points on data, culture and risk. And I suppose when I was just listening to you then, one of the things that keeps coming across my mind as a bit of a governance geek, I suppose, really, is just about the requirements for those who are sitting on boards or in cabinet, wherever they might be within a governance structure for a provider, just about having the skills and the knowledge to know what they should be looking for, which I don't mean that in a patronising way in any way, shape or form, but because of course what you want is interest and scrutiny and but I do think there is something about the nature of what we are talking about, which requires you to be able to see the wood for the trees, to know what you should be looking for, and then to be able to ask the right questions, focus on the right priorities, make sure that you are taking decisions which are in the right sort of environment, the right context for that organisation. I think that's I think it's an interesting one currently, actually.
Yeah, it's a really, a really, really good point. And, you know, we are operating in a co-regulatory environment. So it's absolutely vital that boards understand the regulation. I was asked yesterday by someone, is there kind of benchmark or standards in terms of assurance that we should be seeking? And the answer ultimately is no. Like, you need to be assured yourself. But you can only do that and start to ask the right questions if you have a fundamental understanding of what the regulatory requirements are.
Yeah. I think just I'm going to sort of have a look at some of the questions that have been raised, and there is one that I think aligns with what we were just talking about in terms of reporting and how you are tracking change and improvement. Hannah, there's a question from Alison around whether you made any changes to your KPI suite in order to track sort of delivery, make sure you were concentrating on the right things.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got quite a comprehensive suite of KPIs already, but we knew there were some key areas that these comprehensive service reviews were going to impact. For example, repairs, like Mark said earlier, that has the biggest impact. We were expecting there to be quite a bit of a delay actually coming through the TSMs in terms of the satisfaction. But we've seen a real increase already of 9 percentage points of satisfaction with repairs, which just over from 24 to 25 to this year to date, which has been really good to see. But as Mark said, it's not just about the numbers. We're getting really good levels of feedback from customers. We're starting to see a reduction in complaints. We're starting to see an increase in compliments. And all of this kind of filters through either our regular reporting or through our customer insight report, which also hits the governance structure as well. So there weren't any particular new KPIs, but the suite of KPIs we already had are definitely showing the benefits of the work that we're doing, which is really positive.
Thank you. And Mark, there's a question for you, which is quite a detailed one. Hopefully you can answer it. Just about how your operatives manage doing that front-facing customer service bit, scheduling, as well as completing the repairs. How do you balance that?
Well, interestingly, during the pilot process, what happened was actually by operatives appointing basically their own work and creating their own diaries. They would appoint in anything, they would put pressure on themselves and appoint too much, and then get stressed about, oh no, I can't possibly complete all of these jobs. So we did have to have a number of sessions with them to say, look, be realistic, allow some time during the day to allow for travelling, allow for time for unforeseen bits and pieces, and build that into your working day. So there was, from our more, how can I put this, our more traditionally minded operatives who took a very sort of firm view, we had to use sort of advocacy with them as well, and get people who were very signed up to that way of working, because we had operatives who said, well, this is fantastic because I feel like I'm self-employed, I can manage my own work. And you have to remind them about the amount of times when they've been sent to a job and they weren't the right trade. And we said, well, hang on, you're in control of that now. Do you remember when actually you were getting frustrated? That's now all, within your gift. So it was a kind of a gradual process with them, but they are very supportive. It's like any cultural change process, it's like pebbles on the beach. You have to continually assess and refine what you're doing, and if you can take some of the blockages away from them. And so we've made alterations to the IT that makes it easier to do those appointments. We've worked with the IT provider that we use to chart a bit of a roadmap in terms of future improvements and so on, and we feed that back regularly to the operatives. So I think you have to be good to your word with operatives. Is when they make a suggestion, you've got to follow it through and feed back to them when it's going to be put in place, or if it's not feasible, why it's not.
I suppose that's that mirroring what you're trying to achieve with customers in the way that you behave in relation to colleagues. So yeah, I think that's very much back to that point of culture. Okay. Anything else anybody wants to add? Last call for any questions or anything anybody had a burning desire to say? No? Okay, well, I'm going to bring this to a close then. I do want to thank everybody for attending today, and of course to all of our speakers for their really fab insights and for sharing their experience. I found it really useful. I could probably sit here and talk about it all day, but that probably says more about me. But I hope everybody who's attended has found it useful today. If you require any more information, please do get in touch. I'm Angela Lomax at DTP, Doran Hooker at Capsticks. Our information is available. And of course, as we've said, the session today has been recorded. So if you do have any queries or questions that you want to follow up, we certainly can do so. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for your time. Have a good rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
Cheers,
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.